At 0317 local time, a merchant tanker moving east of the Strait of Hormuz reported an unusual radar picture. Not a missile launch, not a swarm of fast boats, not the sudden rise of Iranian aircraft from Bandar Abbas. It was something quieter. A U.S. Navy surface group had shifted position in the dark water south of the Iranian coastline, holding just outside the most sensitive maritime lanes in the Gulf of Oman. The movement was not dramatic enough to trigger public panic. It did not resemble the opening phase of a strike. No aircraft carrier was photographed cutting through the choke point. No destroyer announced a freedom of navigation transit. No Pentagon official stood at a podium and declared that a new phase had begun. But inside the region's command architecture, the map had changed, because the Navy had not simply moved ships closer to Hormuz. It had placed a new layer of capability near the one waterway Iran has spent 40 years preparing to threaten. And that was the part almost everyone missed. The public story looked familiar. Washington reinforcing the Gulf, Tehran issuing warnings, oil markets watching tanker routes, satellites tracking warships, analysts debating whether another crisis was forming around the world's most dangerous maritime choke point. But the visible layer was not the real story. The real story was hidden in the geometry, where the assets sat, what they could see, what they could reach, and how quickly they could act before Iran could turn pressure into paralysis. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest navigable point. Every day, a major share of the world's seaborne oil moves through its lanes, squeezed between the mountains of southern Iran and the coast of Oman. The shipping lanes themselves are narrower still, 2-mile-wide inbound and outbound corridors, separated by a buffer zone that offers almost no room for error when missiles, mines, drones, submarines, and fast attack craft enter the equation. That is why every U.S. naval movement near Hormuz carries weight. But this movement was different, because the question was not whether America had sent more firepower into the region. The question was why it had placed that firepower where Iran could see only part of it. For years, Iran's strategy in the Gulf has been built around a simple assumption. The U.S. Navy may be powerful, but it is also predictable. Large ships need room. Carriers need distance. Destroyers need radar coverage. Mine countermeasure ships move slowly. Tankers move even slower. And every American platform, no matter how advanced, must operate inside a geography that Iran knows in extraordinary detail. Tehran's military planners do not need to defeat the U.S. Navy in open water. They need to complicate timing. They need to raise costs. They need to create uncertainty in a corridor so economically vital that even a temporary disruption can move global markets. That is the strategic logic of Hormuz, not victory, leverage. And this is why the Navy's latest posture matters, because it appears designed not to answer Iran's first move, but to remove the advantage Iran expects to have before that move begins. The visible architecture is easy to describe. U.S. destroyers and cruisers can bring Aegis combat systems, SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors, Tomahawk land attack missiles, electronic warfare suites, and helicopter detachments capable of surface search and anti-submarine patrol. Patrol aircraft from regional airfields can scan hundreds of miles of water. MQ-9 drones can loiter for more than 20 hours over maritime approaches. P-8 Poseidon aircraft can track submarines and surface contacts across large sectors of the Gulf of Oman. And American bases in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE create a regional support grid that can sustain operations far beyond a single ship formation. But none of that is new. Iran has planned against that architecture for decades. The hidden change is the addition of a smaller, harder-to-read capability positioned near the southern approaches to Hormuz, an unmanned and network strike surveillance layer designed to compress the time between detection and response. Not a superweapon in the cinematic sense, a timing weapon. And near Hormuz, timing can be more decisive than tonnage. A destroyer moving at 20 knots needs more than 3 hours to cover 60 nautical miles. A helicopter launched from its deck can move much faster, but has limited endurance and must return to refuel. A fighter aircraft can reach the area in minutes, but it needs tasking, clearance, targeting data, and rules of engagement. A missile battery ashore can fire quickly, but only if it has a target quality track. A drone can watch for hours, but a drone without integration is just another sensor. The new variable appears to be integration, a distributed weapon sensor system that sits close enough to observe the approaches, far enough to complicate Iranian targeting, and networked tightly enough to turn a suspicious movement into an actionable track before the situation escapes control. That is where the equation begins to shift. Iran's strength around Hormuz comes from proximity. Its coast is lined with radars, mobile missile launchers, hardened tunnels, naval bases, drone sites, and small boat facilities. From Bandar Abbas to Jask, from Keshem Island to the Iranian islands near the traffic lanes, Tehran can disperse weapons across terrain that is difficult to monitor continuously and even harder to neutralize completely. Fast boats can sortie from sheltered inlets. Anti-ship missiles can be moved on road mobile launchers. Drones can be prepared under cover. Mines can be placed by small craft that look civilian until the final minutes. This creates a surveillance problem, not because the U.S. cannot see, but because it must see enough, early enough, and with enough certainty. A single Iranian fast boat leaving port is not automatically an attack. A truck moving near the coast is not automatically a missile launcher. A radar activation may be routine. A drone may be surveillance. A fishing vessel may be exactly what it claims to be, and that ambiguity is part of Iran's operating environment. It creates hesitation. It forces classification. It stretches decision cycles. In the Strait of Hormuz, the first shot is rarely the most dangerous event. The most dangerous event is a 10-minute window before the first shot, when commanders are trying to determine whether a pattern has become an attack. That is the window the U.S. Navy appears to be targeting. A hidden weapon near Hormuz does not need to be the largest weapon in the theater. It needs to alter that window. It needs to deny Iran the luxury of ambiguity. It needs to make dispersed movement visible, connected, and vulnerable before it can become saturation. That is why Iran would notice. Because Tehran's doctrine depends on making the first phase chaotic. Imagine the opening sequence of a crisis. A U.S.-flagged or Allied tanker enters the outbound lane. Two Iranian patrol craft shadow at distance. A coastal radar turns on for less than 90 seconds. A small drone lifts from a concealed launch site and climbs low over the water. A truck-mounted anti-ship missile battery moves from a tunnel mouth toward a firing position. A mine-laying craft waits among commercial traffic. Separately, each action can be explained. Together, they form a pattern. The challenge is recognizing that pattern before it becomes kinetic. A traditional naval force can respond with overwhelming power after the pattern is clear. The new posture seems designed to recognize it while it is still forming. That is the difference. And it matters because the strait is too compressed for slow understanding. From parts of the Iranian coast, anti-ship missiles can reach across the water in minutes. A Nor or Kater-type missile, depending on variant and launch point, can cover tactical distances rapidly enough to force defenders into immediate reaction. Ballistic anti-ship systems create a different challenge, descending from altitude with less warning and a more complex intercept geometry. Loitering munitions and one-way attack drones add volume at lower cost. Small boats armed with rockets or anti-tank missiles do not need to survive long if their purpose is to force escorts to reveal positions, expend ammunition, or break formation around tankers. That is a structural threat, not one weapon. A layered timing problem. The U.S. Navy's visible answer has always been high-end defense. Aegis radars tracking air contacts. Vertical launch cells loaded with interceptors. Electronic warfare suites, jamming seekers. Close-in weapon systems covering the final seconds. Helicopters searching for small craft. Maritime patrol aircraft mapping contacts beyond the horizon. But this architecture has a cost problem. $1 million interceptor against a drone that may cost a fraction of that. A destroyer crew defending a shipping lane against a swarm of unmanned systems and cheap decoys. A high-value warship force to make fire control decisions in crowded water filled with civilian vessels. A carrier air wing capable of devastating retaliation, but not designed to spend day after day chasing every ambiguous contact in a 21-mile choke point. This is where power becomes vulnerability. The more advanced force can still be forced into bad trades. If Iran launches 10 drones, 5 decoys, 2 cruise missiles, and a handful of fast boats in separate directions, the challenge is not just intercepting them. It is sorting them. It is determining what threatens a tanker, what threatens a destroyer, what is bait, and what is designed to expose a defensive network. A single destroyer may carry 90 or more vertical launch cells, depending on class and configuration. But those cells are not infinite, and they are not all loaded with the same weapons. Some are reserved for air defense, some for strike, some for anti-submarine missions. Reloading at sea is not a simple battlefield action. It usually requires withdrawing to a port or protected logistics area. In a sustained crisis, magazine depth becomes strategy. Iran understands this. A saturation attack does not need to sink a ship to achieve effect. It can force expenditure. It can create temporary gaps. It can push escorts away from tankers. It can raise insurance rates. It can make shipping companies pause. It can compel Washington to choose between escalation and endurance. That is a part of the Hormuz equation that is often misunderstood. The Strait is not just a place where weapons might be fired. It is a place where time, cost, and perception become weapons themselves. This is why the new U.S. layer matters. A distributed, unmanned system, combined with electronic surveillance and rapid targeting links, attacks the cost problem from the other direction. Instead of waiting to shoot down everything after launch, it hunts the launch chain. It watches movement. It maps patterns. It identifies emitters. It tracks suspicious vessels before they merge with civilian traffic. It creates a persistent picture that does not rely on one large platform carrying the entire burden. And that changes the geometry. A warship has a radar horizon. A drone has a line of sight. A passive sensor has a listening envelope. A seabed or surface unmanned node has persistence. A satellite has revisit limitations. An aircraft has endurance limits. But network them together, and the map begins to behave differently. Gaps shrink. Movements correlate. False signals become easier to test. A boat leaving one inlet, a drone lifting from another, and an emitter turning on near a coastal road are no longer isolated events. They become a sequence. For Iran, that is dangerous, because the Iranian system is built around dispersion. Move, hide, reveal, strike, relocate. The U.S. system is increasingly built around fusion. Detect, classify, track, assign, respond. The side that compresses this chain first controls the opening minutes. And the opening minutes decide everything. The hidden weapon, then, may not be a single missile with a secret name. It may be a package, unmanned surface vessels, loitering surveillance drones, electronic warfare payloads, undersea sensors, and rapid response fires tied into a common operational picture. The weapon is the network. The shock is not that it exists. The shock is that it has been positioned close enough to Hormuz to threaten Iran's preferred timeline. In a war room, that distinction matters. Rear Admiral Daniel Mercer, a carrier group commander in the region, would not describe the move as dramatic. He would describe it as posture. Posture is the quiet language of deterrence. It is the placement of capability before a crisis becomes visible. It is the difference between sending a message and setting a trap. A message says, "We are here." A trap says, "We are already inside your decision cycle." Commander Elise Hart, an intelligence officer watching the Strait from a regional maritime operations center, would be looking less at ship counts and more at behavior. Which Iranian missile units are moving? Which radars are active? Which patrol craft have changed patterns? Which drones are flying lower, farther, or more frequently? Which commercial vessels are behaving like normal traffic, and which are slowing in places where they should not? The answers matter because Hormuz is a theater of patterns, and patterns reveal intent before statements do. At 0412, a radar operator does not see strategy. He sees tracks. A contact at 18 knots. Another at 6. A drone-sized return fading near clutter. A coastal emitter appearing and disappearing. The screen does not announce escalation. It offers fragments. The commander's job is to turn fragments into judgment. That is where a hidden network becomes powerful. It does not replace human decision-making. It gives decision-makers more time. And time is the rarest commodity in the Strait. Iran's counter is predictable. It will try to locate the new layer. It will test its thresholds. It may send surveillance drones near the southern approaches. It may push patrol craft closer to the traffic separation scheme. It may activate radars briefly to study American reactions. It may use civilian maritime clutter to mask military movement. It may shift missile launchers inland, forcing U.S. sensors to stretch beyond the shoreline. It may lean on proxies elsewhere, creating pressure in the Red Sea, Iraq, Syria, or the eastern Mediterranean to dilute American focus. That is the wider scale. Hormuz is never only Hormuz. A U.S. move near the strait affects oil markets in Asia, insurance markets in London, military planning in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, naval logistics in Bahrain, and political calculations in Tehran. It also affects Beijing, which imports large volumes of energy through vulnerable maritime routes, and Moscow, which understands how energy shocks can shape diplomatic leverage. Every ship in the water is part of a larger board. The new weapon is therefore not just tactical. It is geopolitical. It tells Iran that the United States is not merely preparing to defend a choke point after a crisis begins. It is preparing to contest the hidden preparation phase before Iran can translate geography into coercion. That is a different kind of deterrence. Traditional deterrence says, if you attack, we will respond. This posture says, if you prepare to attack, we may see it early enough to deny the attack structure itself. That is why the move is provocative without being overtly escalatory. It does not require public threats. It does not require crossing into Iranian waters. It does not require a carrier to sit inside a missile envelope for the sake of symbolism. Instead, it places a persistent network capability near the seam where Iran's coastal defense zone meets international maritime flow. That seam is the battlefield. The vulnerability for the United States remains real. Unmanned systems can be jammed. Sensors can be spoofed. Data links can be disrupted. Small platforms can be captured, damaged, or shadowed. A network that depends on connectivity can be attacked through electronic warfare, cyber intrusion, deception, or simple overload. Iran has spent years developing ways to fight without needing a perfect picture of the battlefield. It can use volume, geography, and ambiguity to stress even a sophisticated system. And no sensor network can remove political risk. A misread contact can escalate a crisis. A disabled drone can become a diplomatic event. A warning shot can become a missile exchange. A tanker captain making a wrong turn under pressure can trigger defensive action. In crowded waters, tactical errors have strategic consequences. That is the central danger. The more capability both sides place near Hormuz, the faster the timeline becomes. At 30 minutes, diplomats still have room. At 10 minutes, commanders dominate. At 90 seconds, machines and rules of engagement begin to shape history. This is where the structure strains. Iran wants to keep the threshold ambiguous. The United States wants to clarify it early. Iran benefits when the first phase is crowded and uncertain. The United States benefits when the first phase is mapped and attributable. Iran wants to make every response look risky. The United States wants to make every Iranian move look visible. Two doctrines are now pressing against each other in one narrow waterway. That is why a small positional change can carry enormous weight. The hidden reserve factor sits beyond the strait. It is not only the ships already visible on commercial satellite imagery. It is a capacity to reinforce from multiple directions. Submarines that do not announce their location. Air power that can surge from land bases. Prepositioned logistics that can sustain weeks of operations. Mine countermeasure units that can be moved forward if the threat shifts. Cyber and electronic warfare teams that may already be shaping the information environment before the first public statement is made. The visible force is the deterrent. The reserve force is the pressure. And the pressure is what Iran must now calculate. If Tehran attempts a limited harassment campaign, it risks exposing the very networks it will rely on in a larger crisis. If it launches drones to test a new U.S. layer, it may reveal launch sites, frequencies, control methods, and command patterns. If it escalates through proxies elsewhere, it may justify a broader American regional posture. If it does nothing, it accepts that the U.S. Navy has placed a persistent capability near Iran's most valuable leverage point. None of those choices are clean. That is a strategic trap, not a trap that forces war, a trap that reduces the usefulness of threat. And for a state like Iran, whose Hormuz strategy depends heavily on the ability to threaten disruption without necessarily triggering full conflict, that matters enormously. Because deterrence in the Gulf is not measured only in missiles. It is measured in confidence. The confidence of tanker companies to keep sailing. The confidence of regional allies that the corridor can remain open. The confidence of Iranian commanders that they can pressure the system without losing assets. The confidence of American commanders that they can respond without stumbling into uncontrolled escalation. The new U.S. posture attacks Iranian confidence at its most sensitive point, the early phase, before launch, before swarm, before mine, before denial becomes visible, and that is why the reaction in Tehran would not be panic in the theatrical sense. It would be professional concern, staff officers updating maps, Navy commanders reviewing patrol routes, missile units changing movement schedules, electronic warfare teams probing frequencies, intelligence officers asking whether the U.S. has created a new surveillance net across the southern approach. Because if the answer is yes, then Iran's old assumptions no longer hold fully. The U.S. Navy does not need to dominate every inch of the Iranian coastline to change the balance. It needs to watch the right seams. It needs to hold the right firing options. It needs to shorten the gap between warning and decision. It needs to force Iran to spend more effort hiding, testing, and defending than preparing. That is operational pressure. Quiet, persistent, hard to photograph, and extremely difficult to reverse once established. By dawn, the merchant traffic keeps moving. Tankers follow the lanes. AIS signals blink across commercial tracking screens. Patrol aircraft continue their patterns. Iranian statements remain sharp but measured. The U.S. Navy says little. To the public, it looks like another tense day near Hormuz. But beneath that surface, the geometry has changed. Iran can still threaten the strait. It can still complicate shipping. It can still use missiles, mines, drones, boats, and ambiguity. Nothing about the new weapon makes Hormuz safe. Nothing makes escalation impossible. In fact, the presence of a more capable U.S. layer may make the early hours of crisis even more sensitive, because each side now knows the other is watching more closely and deciding faster. But that is the nature of deterrence near a choke point. Stability is created by readiness, and readiness creates its own danger. The central question remains unresolved. Did the U.S. Navy move this capability near Hormuz simply to defend shipping, or to signal that Iran's most important maritime leverage point is no longer as opaque as it once was? That question is what makes this moment different, because the most important weapon near Hormuz may not be the one that fires first. It may be the one that sees first. The one that connects fragments before they become an attack. The one that forces every Iranian commander to wonder whether his movement has already been classified, tracked, and assigned to a response option. That is the hidden layer. Not shock and awe. Not a headline. Not a single dramatic launch. A quiet compression of time. And in the Strait of Hormuz, time is the battle space. What people saw was the U.S. Navy moving another capability into a familiar region. What Iran had to calculate was something far more serious. Whether the old game of ambiguity still works when the other side has placed a patient, networked weapon near the edge of the board. The visible story is about ships. The hidden story is about timing. And if the next crisis comes, the world may not first notice it through explosions, speeches, or breaking news alerts. It may begin with a track on a screen, a commander's decision in the dark, and a weapon that was already waiting before anyone knew it had arrived. That is why Hormuz feels calm and unstable at the same time. And that is why the next move matters more than the last one. If you want more strategic breakdowns of the unseen military moves shaping global power, subscribe, like the video, and watch the next analysis.